So first off, this is an academic study. This isn't like some survey of 12 people and we don't hold it scientifically accountable. This is scientific process. You co-authored with Edward Mochery and sought to find if people can tell the difference between a poem generated by AI as opposed to one that was written by, a human type brain. And which did they prefer? What did you find?
Well, we found that our participants, which we ran two studies, the first had a little over 1,600 people in it, the second had about 800 people in it. And we found that people could not tell the difference between AI-generated poetry and poetry written by human poets, ranging
Wow.
from Chaucer, Emily Dickinson, Sylvia Plath, Shakespeare. We had 10 different poets in the study, and people could not tell the difference. And in fact, they were a little bit worse than random guessing. People were a little bit more likely to guess that the AI-generated poems had been written by a human than to guess that the actual poems written by humans were written by a human.
And which ones did they like in general? Was there a leaning? Did they prefer the AI or the people poems?
They preferred the AI poems. In our a study where we asked assessments, we asked people to rate poems, rate the overall quality on a scale from extremely good to extremely bad, rate how meaningful, profound, original, witty, how beautiful it was, to what extent it conveyed a mood or emotion, how was the rhythm, how was the sound, did it rhyme? And across all of our rating dimensions, not only were the human written poems not preferred, but the AI poems were rated higher. And that's pretty consistent. Over 78% of our participants gave higher average ratings to AI poems than to human written poems. And all of the AI poems had a higher average rating than all of the human written poems.
Okay, we got to break this apart, right? The machines have taken over. It's like a Stephen King novel suddenly. We got to understand the why, and I'm tempted to ask ChatGPT why this happened, but I'll go to your abstract. You theorize that the human preference for AI poetry could be because the AI stuff is just more straightforward. It's not this Shakespearean gobbledygook. I don't know what he's saying. They can actually follow the flow or the plot of the poem itself. Is that what you heard?
Yes. So we found that in our initial study, when we asked people to judge whether the poems were written by a human or generated by AI, we gave them the option to explain their answers. And most people didn't, but those who did, when judging the human written poem was generated by AI, they often said things like, this doesn't make sense, or this seems like nonsense. One person reading a T.S. Eliot poem wrote in all caps, this doesn't seem like it was written by a human or someone with feelings.
But it was.
It was. It was. It was written by a human being with feelings. But there's something sort of difficult or that requires time and maybe historical context in order to appreciate about a lot of the human poems. Whereas the AI-generated poems are very straightforward. They look like you expect a poem to look, and it's pretty easy to see what the poem is about on your first read of it. And so just to pick two poems that we used in our study, one poem that people did not have very high ratings of is a T.S. Eliot poem, which is sort of an opaque satire, or opaque now. Yeah, there's one of the T.S. Eliot poems in our study is a satire of the readers of the Boston Evening Transcript, which is a newspaper that does not exist anymore.
Right.
And without historical context, it's not that crazy that people prefer the AI-generated Walt Whitman style poem about how awesome nature is. Maybe the rhythm's a little clunky here or there, but that's a much more pleasant reading experience, especially if you're sitting with no historical context, no historical background. And I think part of what we maybe found is that how you interpret a choice that a poet makes depends a lot on giving them some credit for having made it on purpose and knowing what they're doing. It's just sort of the hypothesis here, but when Chaucer, in one of the Chaucer poems, repeats a line multiple times, if you think it might be AI generated, it might just be lazy or an error. But when you know that Chaucer wrote it, when you know someone who was good at this did that on purpose, that sort of forces you to reinterpret it a little bit. And we found that if you tell people that a poem was written by a human, or tell them that that same poem was generated by AI, that has a pretty substantial effect on the qualitative ratings. People like the same poem much better and rate it better at overall quality, as more meaningful, as more original, as wittier. They like the rhythm better when you tell them it was written by a human, as opposed to telling them that it was generated by AI.
Yeah, that's the cognitive bias there that I'm buying in more readily.
Yes. Yeah.
So what I'm pulling from that is the feedback you got in your study is that people get it more readily, more quickly, more widespread when it's AI generated. And that's probably a key lesson for us as communicators and marketers to pull from here, that if you're dealing with masses, they need to get it very, very quickly. And you can't guide them to an inside joke or an inside story or tap in. But if there is a niche audience that you're going for, maybe it is more valuable to tap into that inside story. So let me ask you, because I know you went to some poetry experts in some capacity and said, what do you think? It's not in your abstract, but I know you went. So the experts must have easily figured out, oh, no, because they're in it, right? They know Chaucer and they know Whitman. The poetry experts must have said, no, I prefer the human generated poetry, and easily deducted and distinguished the difference between the two.
Well, we did, in a small pilot, you look at poetry experts, people in MFA programs for poetry, people with English PhDs studying poetry.
The smart people,
yes,
the smart people who know the difference, yes.
Yeah, some of them had published poetry, they were published poets. And they did do pretty well at the discrimination task, but 100% of them reported having seen several of the poems before.
That were AI generated.
No, they said they'd seen the human written poems before.
Oh.
They just recognized that they could go, oh, that's Shakespeare's Sonnet 115 or whatever. Then it's a memory task.
Right.
Less than can you tell what sounds human or what sounds AI generated? So we are working on getting a more reliable test of poetry experts. I'm working on a project now with a researcher in Edinburgh to have poets contribute unpublished poems. And we're hoping to create an online interface and release it and let people in the public. You can go online and take the test yourself and see how you do. And hopefully, since the poems aren't published, there won't be a risk that the experts already know the right answers for half the questions.
So if I, as a public relations pro, a marketing pro, if my sort of thought is, ChatGPT or Claude are great, but they can't tap the emotion the way I, a professional, can tap into emotion because they don't have any human experience. Am I coming to the right conclusion, or am I missing something rather gaping here?
Well, it's important to remember that the large language models that we're looking at, whether it's ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or Llama 3, these have never had a human emotion, but they have read much more than you have about human emotions. They've read everything that's ever been written about every emotion, and they are really good at imitating that. So one of the things we found in our study was that part of the tendency for people to think AI-generated poems were written by humans at fairly high rates, part of that is that they underestimated how good AI would be at communicating human emotions. And it's actually very good at least imitating the communication of human emotions and evoking human emotions. A couple of our participants wrongly guessed that AI-generated poems were written by humans because the poems made them laugh, and they didn't think AI could do that. But AI can be funny sometimes. And if you want to evoke an emotion or communicate an emotion, AI may be a useful tool. It can help you do that. If you want to say something new and original about the human experience, if you want to say something no one's ever said before or articulate something in a genuinely new way, the way that I think a lot of poets aim to do, well, then AI is at a pretty substantial disadvantage because it doesn't have the human experience that you're trying to communicate something about. It only has what's been said before. So real originality is kind of a weakness, and it's a weakness that's sort of baked into the core concept. It's sort of fundamental to the enterprise that it's only trained on predicting what the most likely next token is. It's trained on figuring out what sounds like everything that came before. So if you want something with mass appeal, AI is probably going to do a very good job. If you want to make something unique that captures something about someone's experience in a way they've never heard before, AI is probably not going to help you do that.
I've watched sitcoms and Hollywood movies, and I just have to think the Hollywood Screenwriters Guild is not going to like this study at all. But any notable difference between genders or age groups? Did anything stand out that way or no?
So we asked participants a lot of demographics questions, and we didn't find any impact of age or gender or even experience with poetry. Now, there's a bit of a ceiling on our, the level of expertise that participants reported having, but people who read poetry weekly didn't do better than people who read poetry less than once a year. People who'd taken poetry courses before didn't do better than people who hadn't. There is one minor caveat there, which is we did find that even when controlling for how much you read poetry and how much you like poetry and things like that, people who in our demographics questionnaire identified as non-binary did perform better at the discrimination task. But approximately 2% of our participants reported being non-binary. So the sample size is a little small to sort of draw conclusions from reliably. But that is a statistically significant effect according to our models.
Let's pull some pontifications and potential conclusions here. Is this suggesting that AI should be embraced as a legit artistic collaborator? Or put more darkly, is it a tool that risks overshadowing human creativity?
I think my answer is different for the two ways of putting it. The bright way of putting it, I think, absolutely. I think AI as an artistic collaborator can be very useful for brainstorming. It's great. It can come up with 15 different ways to say something in a matter of seconds. Even if you don't use any of the ideas it spits out, it might help you figure out what you don't want. It's sort of like the Thomas Edison finding 2,000 ways not to make a light bulb. ChatGPT will get you to 2,000 ways not to phrase something much faster than you could on your own.
Right.
So as an artistic collaborator, it can be useful in a lot of ways. There's a artist, Sasha Stiles, who is a sort of AI poet who writes poetry in collaboration with an AI model and is very optimistic about AI as a tool for art and poetry and thinks of language as a technology for getting an idea from my head to someone else's head. So, if language is a technology for getting ideas from one head to another, then AI as a tool for producing language is just another form of technology. It's another tool in your tool belt to get an idea out of your head and into someone else's, which is an important part of almost every form of communication. It's maybe a pretty good definition of communication. So as a collaborator, AI is potentially very useful, depending on how you use it. As a replacement, I don't think it's going to replace human creativity anytime soon. It's not going to make us obsolete. It might make us more efficient and might mean that you need fewer writers to get the same output each year. That's sort of what the software industry has discovered in the last couple of years is that one senior software developer with a Copilot and Claude Sonnet can produce all of the code that a team of junior developers used to produce. So there may be some changes to how human creativity and how many people there are for the same output. There may be changes coming there to a variety of industries, but we're not going to be completely replaced at any point, because to have this sort of new and interesting thing to say, or to have an idea of what it is that you're trying to communicate, the idea still has to come from a human head. The thing you're trying to communicate still has to come from a person.
The dark side of me would say there's nothing actually new in this world, and everything that is to be said or created has been said or created in a previous iteration. So that's, you and I could philosophically go back and forth on that. Your study looked at the written word and the spoken word. What about art? Could AI generate paintings? Is that a potential study in the future? Because I could not tell the difference. And my wife's an artist. She's an oil on canvas artist, and she would probably scold me for saying that, but and she does listen. Could this be replicated with art?
I think there is some evidence that AI-generated images are already, to a general audience, indistinguishable from human-made paintings. Whether, I think you were probably right. You and I probably could not tell the difference. Whether your wife, the artist, could, that remains to be seen. I haven't seen a study that tested professional artists and painters, and that would be interesting to see. But I think paintings and poetry are currently at the same point where the general public cannot tell the difference, at least not without seeing examples ahead of time. You need either to be trained to distinguish, or you need domain expertise.
Appreciate this. I really appreciate time on this today, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for having me.